Maria Adele Carrai, you're in the Big Apple with big snow upon you, and we're sitting in a sunny London and Durham for a change. Welcome to BRI Dialogues. We're excited to have you with us. Very few have looked as closely as you have done to the myth and to the realities of debt diplomacy around BRI. And given your optics and lens of having drilled down into the dynamics of Belt Road Initiative and its snaking into Europe and Africa, what is the real picture? And are we looking at it through headlines, and there's more to unpack there?
Hi, so thank you so much for having me here today. And in terms of BRI and the debt trap diplomacy narrative, I think that it's a bit off, and the situation on the ground is much more complex. I think one first element to consider is that we think this initiative as like being clearly coordinated from the center. Xi Jinping like controls over all these different projects, and it's actually not the case. And even the compilations of data on the BRI that seems to be the most accurate, right? For instance, Boston University came up with we have all the loans that China give, is still so far from the true picture. So I think it's important to keep in mind that our knowledge of all the projects of the BRI is still quite limited. We don't have at all. We're not even close to have all the data of all the projects. And also there's like a lot of different actors, Chinese actors involved, private and public state-owned enterprises. And all these processes are very non-transparent. So we don't know, it's very hard to have access to this kind of data. That said, I think that from the, and also doing research, there's no evidence, and it's not just me saying that, but also other important scholars have done real work on the ground, they have data. I don't think there is any intent from the Chinese central government to put other countries into debt trap, because this would be detrimental for China now that is increasingly under international scrutiny. With the US-China competition, China is considered as an existential threat. So everybody's watching what China is doing. And so if really like start to take assets from other countries that cannot pay back the debt would be very bad. And for its reputation, international reputation, and also for the kind of reputation of the good country that share the same Bandung spirit with this developing world, like, that respects sovereignty of other countries. So if they really start to taking assets, that will really undermine its claims of being this country that has solidarity toward them, that respects sovereignty and so forth. Like it will challenge the key principle of Chinese foreign policy. So I don't think it's the case, and it's not the case, doesn't happen.
One quick follow-up on that. When you talk about the development and the way that China has come out, would it be fair to say that the big state enterprises were like icebreakers, and BRI 2.0 is growingly a wave of small and medium-sized enterprises and private sector coming into the picture? Is that something that you see developing?
I don't think so. I think that the BRI 2.0, the private enterprises have always been there, and maybe they are the ones that really open up for maybe small enterprises, private enterprises that adventure themselves in the developing world or in other countries, and then like you start also having state-owned enterprises going there. I think they're a mix of things, but I don't think that the private enterprises will their number will increase like after state-owned enterprises open up. I don't think, of course, like if a state-owned enterprises, Chinese state-owned enterprises start finance, like a Chinese bank finance a project, let's say in Ghana, and then you have a Chinese state-owned enterprises building some project, then of course there is all an ecosystem of other private Chinese companies that will follow, right? But yeah, I see the private enterprises always kind of been there and like try to interpret in their own way what the BRI means. Everybody took advantage of this imaginary, I would call it, of the BRI, because it doesn't really exist. It exists in our imagination, the BRI. There isn't up to date, there isn't yet a list of all the BRI projects. So what are we talking about? Again, a lot is also this imagination and like countries or private companies from China or elsewhere that they try to take advantage of this money that are, supposed to get to, host countries. And sometimes they're not even disbursed. So it's a lot of, air, like, words with sometimes not much substance.
But Adele, that also suits the Chinese because it reinforces the narrative of global engagement with their agenda. There was a report I was reading that has 139 countries now having affiliated themselves with the BRI. That I see as a kind of a two-sided coin. One side is it's positive to have these loose connections because you can limit them or walk away from them. But the other side of it, as you've rightly said, where is the substance to all of this? It's interesting that, China's investments in BRI projects, however we want to calculate it, which you're rightly highlighting, dropped from 120 billion in 2015 to under 20 billion in 2019-20. This is a massive drop of resource. Does that mean that they are now going to do much more local financing of projects, or does it indicate a massive cutback on the projects and the ambitions that were first put forward? Yeah.
So I think the ambitions are still there. Also because the great thing, the smart thing that I think the leadership did was that it's ambitious, but it's not clearly defined. So you don't, again, have a list of achievable goals, right? There is this grand narrative, grand goals, but they aren't really pinned down. So it can hardly fail or it can hardly succeed. It can go both ways. But in terms of money flowing, like, BRI money, we saw this dramatic decrease of foreign direct investments from China to these countries. And the reasons are many. I think, first of all, like we had the pandemic, and also China is, it has a lot of troubles domestically, like, evergreen, like it's just the tip of the iceberg, if you want. And so it has a lot of money saving that it can spend abroad. It has overcapacity, and so that's it's good to employ this workers or know-how like elsewhere. But I also think that given all the media coverage that BRI has received, I think now they're much more careful with all the projects. So even when I did my fieldwork in Kenya for the second installment of the funding from China Exim Bank, they were blocking it. So let's review everything. So I think they're much more careful. And I think probably at the beginning, they just went out, they gave all this money, very often prompted by the host government, right? So in the case of Sri Lanka, was Sri Lanka that approached China to us to build the Hambantota port. Wasn't Chinese initiative, as most of the other initiatives are not necessarily initiated by China. Oh, I want to build a dam here. No, it's always kind of solicited by the host country, or in most cases. But I think now there's been much more scrutiny about the project that are built. They have to be more sustainable. There's much more awareness of corporate social responsibility. So you don't want to do projects that harm environment or labor. I mean, there's, again, much more awareness. And I talked about learning curve of China. So China has this very speed learning curve through which it's learning to improve this project, to better understand the local conditions. Like, China doesn't have all this experience as Western donors in all these different countries. So in the past decades or so, it has to slowly learn and adjust and be more careful.
I'm really glad you mentioned your fieldwork in Kenya. You're one of those unique individuals who's actually been to the coalface. You've done on-the-ground research and you've explored what is going on very much in terms of nitty-gritty of projects. And you did this fascinating comparison of two railway systems in different countries. I would love you to hear you explain the research that you did, the comparison that you did, and what were your findings from that project?
Yeah. So the reason is that like those two railroads that were financed and built by China in Ethiopia and Kenya had a kind of different success. And so in Ethiopia, it wasn't that successful. Like also when I went, the railroad was not operational, was impossible to buy tickets. I mean, they ran into a lot of troubles. While Kenya was much better, although there were still issues. But you know, those issues, many of those issues have been addressed. And talking to local stakeholders and also Chinese representatives of Chinese Exim Bank and the state-owned enterprises that build those projects, I found out that like there was awareness about corporate social responsibility more and more. But then sometimes they didn't really know about all the guidelines that the Chinese government has issued about corporate social responsibility, that you have to respect this and that. So there was this kind of lack of awareness. This is a gap between what the central government was issuing in terms of regulations, policies, guidelines, and what those state-owned enterprises were doing on the ground. And maybe they were more familiar with the host country regulation, not the Chinese government regulation on corporate social responsibility. But then one of my findings was that there was a lot of responsiveness of this Exim Bank and the state-owned enterprises that built the actual railroads to society, to media. And so we saw the evolution, how this report, so they started issuing their own report on corporate social responsibility, paying much more attention. And I think that one of the reasons why the results were different in Ethiopia and Kenya is that Kenya has much more active civil society that was much more critical, voiceful about the issues that the railroad ran into. So for instance, the environmental impact that was negative, or labor. And I think the Chinese state-owned enterprises, like a representative, they were very concerned. Like, you know, we don't have to, we cannot afford to have this negative kind of depiction of ourselves in the media. And so they really try to address, to do something good, to show that like they have all the good intents. But it was very much of a reaction to the host country's situation, legal situation, how good the legal system was, and then they will adapt. So that's why I talked about adaptive governance, right? It's not really a top-down necessarily, although they're trying to move more in that direction, that there's more control from the central government of this state-owned enterprises and also private actors operating abroad. But from my research, at least up to 2019, there was a lot of adaptation, pragmatism and adaptation to the local circumstances.
It's very interesting the insight you share with us, Adele. But the other thing is that, as I say, and you just eloquently elaborated, it takes two to tango. So the conditions are very much dependent on the counterparty on the ground. But the thing about this gap that you highlighted between the central government and the local state-owned enterprises approach in execution is as well a good news, because it means that eventually they have to follow the guidelines as their performance and benchmarking that may come from their paymasters, and this will catch up. But you also touched on the fact that they're learning very quickly. And my question is that, having been on the ground, how do you see the learning speed of the Chinese companies and state-owned enterprises in context of BRI, and the speed of Build Back a Better World, or B3W initiative? Would you see that BRI 2.0 or BRI 3.0 would be very hard to catch up, at least in continental Africa and Europe, for America to catch up with? Or
I wrote also a piece for Hirman Foundation that compares the Build Back Better World, the 3W whatever, and the BRI. And I think it's, so first of all, the Build Back Better World is still at its infancy. So it's a lot of words, again, much more words than substance than probably BRI. And it's hard to coordinate all the G7 countries that might have different objectives and goals in the relationship with China, and also host countries like developing world. It's very hard because they try to, it's almost impossible right now to compete with China. And what I argue in my paper is that perhaps we don't have to compete on building infrastructures in Africa. That was probably part of our colonial past. There are other ways to be present, to feel the influence of, of the liberal world, G7 in other countries, rather than building infrastructures, because China comes in with a package that is very hard to compete with. Like, so it comes with the banks that give the money, the insurance, the constructor that have all this experience building things. They're cheaper in most cases than Western companies. They're fast. They also, because sometimes they skip all this kind of either investigations or economic return. So now they're better, but they have a bit less bureaucracy perhaps. And also what the Build Back Better World wants to do is increasing the standards, increasing regulations. That means increasing the time, increasing the cost. And so that's a bit problematic when you are, again, in a developing world that needs the street or the railroad down, the infrastructure down at, quick and cheap. And so China comes in with this package. And again, it's very hard to compete with.
Funny you say that. I recently argued for America to focus on B3A, which is Build Back Better Americas, and focusing on American continent before the Chinese arrive at Latin America as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the, the US has a lot of challenges in its foreign policy right now. Many really tough challenges for the Biden administration, or whoever will replace him in the years to come. But I think one of the most important things for America before it engages globally is to really strengthen itself. Even like, when we talk about democratic values, like democracy is partly crumbling within America, or, we talk about the rule of law, human rights. I think the first thing for America is to really, get back to itself, strengthen itself, and then, it can go abroad. And of course, like, it's hard because it's already engaged militarily, economically. So it cannot just leave and withdraw from everything and focus on itself, but definitely it has to strengthen America first, build back better within America, and then you can build back better the world. And also another point that I made in my piece is that America has crumbling infrastructures at home. Like, I live now here in New York, and the subway it hasn't been updated, and the cost of updating the subway is the highest in the world. So how can you really compete with Chinese in Africa? So it's just not very reasonable. It doesn't seem that reasonable.
Point well made, Adele. And that is a very nice segue into for me to put your other hat on, which is looking at Europe and EU in particular in terms of your interests and expertise. One could argue that one of the problems with B3W is precisely because it is so vague and unviable, that EU has decided to do its own thing. Or that you could argue actually EU is doing its own thing because the BRI has pushed Europe to finally start taking responsibility. So we have the Europe-Asia strategy document, which came out in 2018. And then within 2-3 years, we have the Global Gateway strategy, which is got a price tag that the previous one didn't have, and it has all sorts of bells and whistles attached to it. First, could you tell us, how did we get so quickly from Europe-Asia strategy that talked about working with China in concert to global gateway, which the Chinese at least see as a direct competition.
Yeah. So I think the Western world, the European Union and America, they're facing this new China challenge. And so that is clear, like also in policy documents where China is being described as a competitor. So China is no longer just a partner. It can be a partner, but is also an important competitor that the European Union and the US needs to face. And so I think that's what motivates moving away from seeing China as a partner and really creating this global gateway as something that more exclude China and tries to come up with a detailed solution, right, with some numbers in it. That's not just words, but also add some numbers and substance. And yeah, I think it's real. I mean, there is competition, and there is a China that I think both the European Union and America are still struggling to figure it out, how to deal with China in the 21st century, how the world is changing. I think we're really in the middle of a major world transformation, geopolitical transformation. And I think we're just kind of slowly realizing that as European or as Americans, and adjusting our policies. But definitely China now is a competitor, is recognized as a competitor. And then, you know, all these policies, we cannot just work with China with the BRI, but we have to create our own plan.
But G2S seems to be wanting to compete with China in Europe rather than compete with China elsewhere. When you start looking at the fine print of it, is actually looking at investing in other parts of Europe that have suffered from the Commission's neglect, which ironically is something that we say about BRI, that BRI is about China, not about the rest of the world. So, so where do you see these fault lines opening up and closing?
Yeah, so I think one of the major problems in Europe, like, I mean, Europe is still in a process of, you know, it's united, the European Union, but there's still a lot of challenges and movements within different countries, populist movements that are against Europe, that want to leave European Union. So the European Union is not that is integrated, but there are always risks and threats from all sides. And China likes the strategy of divide et impera, right? Has been discussed very often. So divide and rule. And for instance, one can read the 16+1. I think it kept changing the number. It was 16+1, then became 17+1. Then I think someone left. So now I think it's back to 16+1, if I'm not wrong. And so basically this 16+1 or 17+1 is a format that it's a kind of a series of dialogues between China and the Central and Eastern European countries that are, you know, they felt marginal from the center, from, you know, France, Germany, that are the leading kind of countries, if you want, in the European Union. And China also promoted or said it was going to invest all these monies in the Central and Eastern European countries. Some of it didn't happen, and so some of these countries are upset. But I think probably the global gateway is to reinforce the integration of a European Union, to make sure that countries like in the Central and Eastern European Union, especially the Balkans, don't you know, go on the other side. I think one important one is, for instance, Hungary. Hungary is quite problematic. There's like a lot of ties with China. But then if you actually look at the data, so there is all this concern about China spreading authoritarianism also in Europe, investing all this money in Europe and like taking over, if you think about Greece, all the ports. But then if you look at data, like European countries, Central and Eastern European countries still depend on European Union. It's still the European Union is still the entity that gives the most money and investment to these countries. So, you know, I don't see them going away, but I think this global gateway really is to reinforce the unity of the European Union, make sure that we're all together, we're on the same page. European Union doesn't abandon the countries that are more marginal to the Union.
Very interesting. This, I would say, perhaps angle that you have spent time on, adapting governance or adaptive governance. Would you, sitting in New York as a European professor, researcher, having looked at continental Africa and even Europe itself, adapting to something that is growing is one thing, adapting to something that you cannot predict is another challenge. And in the past, at least 5, 6, 7 years, the United States has gone through a lot of disruptions, as you addressed. How would that play into B3W and BRI in terms of reliability? So if you're a developing country sitting in Africa or underdeveloped country and need political capital and consistency in dealing with your counterparty, and God knows if in 2 years' time Donald Trump is back, there will be another disruption. Is that as well playing into the sale of Chinese in terms of consistency in policy and investment and the reception they receive in some of the geographies you have spent time in?
I don't think that's a major concern. I mean, also because the investments are long-term processes that they don't necessarily get touched by changes in presidents, like the president of the United States. So this maybe is more marginal than like the policy that he makes to please the domestic constituencies. Yeah, I don't think it really plays out. It's that important thing. Also because the Chinese is not that stable. Like I don't think we have a lot of stability. Yeah, there is a Chinese Communist Party and it will stay in power, but there are so many challenges also within China. So I think that it's hard. They can also, revert back to other solutions. So I don't think that the Chinese are seen as more stable, as more reliable partner than Americans or Europeans. No, I don't think that's the case.
Adele, your conversation reminds me of the story of the three ugly sisters. And for the sake of the story, not that we can attach this to anybody, but if you look at Build Back Better, the American slogan, the European Gateway and BRI, it seems these three ugly sisters are all vying for appearing more attractive, if you like, to the world at large. And I've been struck in the Global Gateway Strategy document, pointed references to what Europe sees as the chink in China's armor. They use language like highest environmental and social standards, debt sustainability, democratic values. Could you tell us a bit more about the genesis of this narrative? And also, how do you think China is receiving this language? And does that probably explain what you were saying, that they are now becoming sensitive to these issues as well? So is this narrative actually improving the state of the world?
I mean, a lot is narrative. So again, I think if I were a developing country in Africa or a developing world, and I need money to build infrastructures, I don't care about the narrative. I care about the substance. So I think that is important to distinguish these two elements. And okay, if we just stay in the narrative plans, right? Democracy and that sustainability is real, but like about values, now the competition is very often framed in terms of China being an authoritarian state and the West as a liberal world that kind of the embodiment of the highest value of democracy, human rights, rule of law. And I think that is really what is the winning card for Europe or for America. But again, then once you look at the substance, it's, and okay, what is the reaction of China? I think China is aware of that, but now it's playing by twisting the language, right? So for instance, it just issued a document on democracy. China is also democracy. So it's sensitive to these narratives. And that's why I think there was also part of the change of the drop in investment, Chinese investments abroad, is also due to its sensitivity and these criticisms. And so now let's do things better. Let's make these loans more sustainable. Also for China itself, because otherwise it loses money, it loses reputation, it loses soft power. But I think, yeah, the reaction of China is like being quite sensitive about these things, but then twisting the language, making it more, that it loses its original meaning. Yeah, we're also democracy. We have human rights. We have rule of law with Chinese characteristics. We also promote democracy. So actually, they don't really promote democracy abroad because they try to be to stick to the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, so that respect of sovereignty, non-interference in domestic affairs. They don't try to promote a model of China governance abroad. They don't force it into other countries. They try, and that's a rhetoric.
Adele, what do you think can go wrong? And if these 3 sisters that Anush was referring to, if they're going to this global party, what can go wrong for them, for their outfits, for their high heels, for their, appearance, each of them, from BRI to, Build Back Better World? What can go wrong in your opinion for each of them? What are the biggest risks?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest risks is that they fail. But for instance, so the BRI, it's already part of the imagination of many countries. And I think as a rhetoric, as a narrative, it's now you have all these projects about reconnecting Eurasia. I don't think it will necessarily go away. And again, there's been a drop in terms of money, but I think what it has produced, I think it's here to stay also in the future. For the global gateway, I think it might be more problematic because once you start to put more precise numbers, projects, then that can fail. And it's clear if it fails or if it's successful. And if it fails, I think it will harm, if you want, like European Union reputation, or it just dies out. I think what I see also for the Build Back Better World, maybe not the global gateway, but for the Build Back Better World as being just air, that now people talk about it, but without really much substance. And I don't see that becoming anything near BRI. And probably in 2 years, we will forget about it.
I want to just have a quick follow-up, and I'll then wait for Anush to jump in because I'm sure he has something to share with both of us. But when you look at SGR, it started 2014 and finished in 2017 or inaugurated. That's 3 years. It's been almost 2.5 years with COVID, right? So I think this gap, as well as you rightly said, has created a more appetite for development. Oh, look at, we've been sitting because of COVID for 2.5 years. That is exactly the same time, despite all the challenges, that SGR was to the speed and on the budget, as you said, executed and delivered. Is this a sense of as well a pent up demand from some of these developing countries for more projects by any of these 3 actors, and more so for BRI because of its inroads?
Yeah, I think that there is definitely demand. And one of the kind of fears also during the pandemic was, and also when China, the investments of China, development financing of China declined, I think there was this concern among developing countries that the source of investments abroad was going to decline, would stop. And so they were kind of not panicking, but there was concern. There is always need and demand for development. And I think there was probably a hope to put forward all this money there, the Build Back Better World. I mean, I'm sure there is interest and probably more demand as a reaction to this plans and project. But again, one thing is words and like declaration, the other thing is substance, what is actually built. And it's so important to keep in mind, right? There's all this declaration, yeah, we build better, we respect its values, but then what is actually built? Maybe nothing. So we have to see what's going to happen.
Right. Interesting you should say that, Adele, because OECD's report on infrastructure investment runs into trillions of dollars in Asia in particular. And you know, you could argue that none of these three initiatives, if you like, go anywhere near meeting the whole investment needed, but at least they try and reach, the Chinese in particular are trying to make inroads into those. So for once, we now have a price tag attached to the BRI's competitors, and Global Gateway talks about $300 billion, and it puts it in terms of a public and private sector funded projects to invest in global infrastructure, right? Despite China's opaque system, at least we know where the money's coming from. And at the end, we'll know where it's going. I am still confused about what is happening with this 300 billion. Who is putting it on the table? How are they going to spend it? And is there money in it for the private sector?
Yeah, so I think it's needed. I'm not too familiar with the Global Gateway plan. I haven't studied yet closely, so I'm not sure. But what Western countries have tried to do is to really bring private sector. So the Build Back Better world is mostly private sector coming in. And I suspect that also the Global Gateway will try to include the private sector, try to have private investors coming in and invest in infrastructures abroad and within Europe. And of course, it's challenging bringing in private sector because when you talk about infrastructures, there's so many risks, and the gain are very much long-term, very risky. So that's why I think China, with the public sector, with this its own policy banks coming in, its own state-owned enterprises, it's so much easier, right, to direct, to channel this public money for building infrastructures.
So here's the question then for you, Adele.
Yeah.
Given that private sector is to be encouraged in the Global Gateway strategy, given that China is already on the ground in Eastern Central Europe and elsewhere, what would happen in European Union's mind if Europe's private sector companies decide to co-deliver projects with Chinese state-owned enterprises? Have they thought through the implications of these?
I think that would be fine. I think unless it's really forbidden to collaborate with China, and it happened already in the past. So you have some vendors that are like European or American when China built its own railroad. So it happened even in terms of financing. There's been some forms of collaboration, and I don't see a problem per se, on the ground. But then, of course, if you talk about the broader geopolitical, geoeconomic concern, security concern, what are the implications? Then it's a bit more tricky once you enter there, because it's fine, I think, to collaborate and, to have partnership with China. But I think there is now much more concern about security implication, competition, geoeconomics and geopolitics. And so even if you collaborate, you build a port, like China builds a port, like think about Djibouti, just to give an example. So yeah, the European comes in and help, then might harm the security, military interest of Europeans in the area. So it's tricky because BRI has a lot of different objectives, right? Is to spread, to improve Chinese soft power, hard power, economic power. And so like once you collaborate with China, you can always see as like black and white. So like, I collaborate with China, then this has negative impacts toward the grand strategy of European Union or America.
So for example, if Hawaii wants to provide the digital infrastructure of a port operation in Greece,
Yeah.
you then are feeling and
Concern,
confronting very
exactly.
much those geopolitical problems that you're now highlighting. That one side or the other needs to find a way forward out of this, right?
Yeah, and you can see that already. For instance, I've done some work in the screening mechanism that have been risen like by European Union and also CFIUS in America, that now almost any kind of investment is screened, or there are always some sort of security implications. And that's really like how you want to see, like, you know, your collaboration or competition with China. That it can be so totalizing, like, you know, the competition is everywhere, that you cannot even collaborate on small projects because they're all concerned about some security implications and so forth. So it is a very tricky situation where I think it would be great for the two countries to collaborate, and there is some space for synergies and collaborations, but then there is always a risk that it's you know, there's again some security implications, and you know, you strengthen China geopolitically, geoeconomically, and you don't want that. So
it's very interesting. We're sitting in a Britain that has left Europe, talking to an Italian professor sitting in New York, talking about China's ambitions in the world, and we're all struggling to collaborate and cooperate at the macro level as humanity. But let me ask you and close with two questions, Adele, because this has been a fascinating conversation. What is your single advice from Maria Adele Carrai to the xenophobes and to xenophiles? If you were to give each party one piece of advice, what would that be?
Yeah, balance and facts. Look at facts. It's hard sometimes to get the facts right, but there are still great scholars that you know, have years, decades of research on China. So, you know, try to select better the information that you get, and really try to be based on facts. And it's very difficult nowadays because of the polarization also of information that people receive. I see more xenophobe than xenophile, at least here in America. And it's a bit of a pity because, again, China is a real challenge and a real threat. There are definitely security implications, but then, you know, there are people-to-people exchanges. Like, you know, we cannot just cut our relationship from China. I mean, it's impossible. We have to collaborate on so many global issues. So we have to find some more balance and really try to make an effort to access good information that is not biased. And
yeah, that's sage advice coming from somebody who has got feet in several continents, as you do, Adele. You've covered a lot of ground in our conversation and dialogue this afternoon here, and your morning there in New York, which Ali and I very much appreciate. But if you were to have the final word, would you say that the discussions around COP26 in Glasgow last year are going to make any meaningful impact on the way in which the three ugly sisters are now trying to carve up the world in terms of infrastructure development?
So I think that is good that there is some competition, that the three sisters are there. And I think developing work can take advantage of the kind of competition that exists and the money, or the declared money that is out there for building infrastructures. So it is positive that also development and infrastructure kind of return to the center of discussion, because before it was very much marginal, who cares, right? But now connectivity, infrastructures, building, it's back, which is great. Different perspective, different ways to go about it, competition, some tensions, but I think it's overall good, right? Because as you said, there's like trillions of dollars of infrastructure needs that can hardly be covered by any of the three sisters put together, but at least it's a first step. And also I see, for instance, European Union with the global gateway and also Build Back Better World, the emphasis on transparency, debt sustainability, that I think is all good, even if they don't put much kind of substance in the especially the Build Back Better World in real project, building real infrastructures. It's still good for China to face this criticisms, right? Or to have this competition, because a competition for the better. That's what I hope, that even if there is competition, is a competition that rise up the standards, that have infrastructure built all over the world. So I think it's positive that bring back at the center connectivity, environment, but within certain standards. So I think it's positive.
And this is exactly why we have someone of your caliber distinction with us, because your words hopefully will echo with people who make these decisions on everyone's behalf. And if they listen to you, hopefully when they listen to you, they realize that actually these are all win-win scenarios rather than zero-sum scenarios. And that in the last analysis, go on.
No, I think it's not a zero-sum game. So I think but also win-win maybe is too optimistic, because there are some damages that are done. And so I think win-win, there are always losers, I think. And so especially if you go at the local people, like people that have been moved away from displaced, because you have to make space for development. So I think there are always losers and winners. So win-win, I think, is too optimistic. But
so what would you call it? What would you call it?
Win-win-lose. But there is someone that loses. So it's not possible that there's just win-win. So there's always, if you think more broadly at the implication, you can have less losses, especially if you increase the standards. But there is always someone that somehow loses, and it should be taken into account as well.
Well, today for us, it has been a win for having you with us and talking about facts and balance. I was thinking while you were elaborating, balancing the factual realities and the facts and the realities on the ground is the most important thing. And one of the things Anoush and I have been trying to do is to turn these sessions into Pilates sessions, the strategic Pilates sessions across BRI Dialogues. But Anoush, why don't you close it? So we let Maria to run to the snow outside and have some hot chocolate in New York.
I think your corrective at the end was very much appreciated, Adele, that there are always correctives that have to be accounted for and put in the balance of these final decisions, that at the end of the day, we've got to be very sensitive to how the resources are allocated and at what cost to people on the ground, which is, again, your own research has highlighted very strongly. We couldn't have had a more fruitful conversation with somebody who is so self-aware and is also so expert over the subjects that are dealing with. So it's been a pleasure, Adele, having you with us. And hopefully we'll see you this side of the pond soon. But in the meanwhile, stay dry and warm, but do get out there and enjoy what remains of the infrastructure in the Big Apple. So thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure being here, and this Pilates session was great. So thank you so much. I hope to see you again from the other side of the pond.
Thank you, Adele. Thank you.
Bravo. Thank you.